I'd like you to imagine for a second that you're a young, single college student living in the dorms or in an apartment. It's 9:38 in the evening. You're tired. You've probably just choked down some bland ramen with a little of frozen vegetables for your dinner, and you're staring at an open textbook. You have your notes and class lectures to your right, and to your left is probably something approximating your sixth or seventh cup of coffee. Tomorrow, you're going to have an exam. Not the final, not the murder. Just an exam. An exam that counts for one of four exams that account for, in themselves, 70% of your grade. Your eyes are falling shut. Your throat is dry. You're anxious. You have a cold flush going over your body. But despite all of this, your heart is pounding in your veins. You're finding it hard to focus, like your brain is walking in a fog or a blur. You might think to yourself, why am I doing this to myself? Why is this test causing me so much stress? Why is it so important? Why are there so many tests? Tests. Tests to get in, tests to get out, tests to prove I'm smart, tests to prove my worth, tests to make me vote, tests to let me drive a car, tests. It seems that all throughout American academia and your life, it's just been one test, going to one test, going to one test. And you've probably forgotten half of the stuff you studied for those tests. It's never stuck to you the same way a lecture has, or a epiphany has, or that moment when you and your friends are just chatting and coming upon a great philosophical discovery. To you, it's more than likely a test is just an obstacle you have to overcome so you can get a grade, so you can move forward. And that's how a lot of people feel testing is. Because that's what testing in America was designed for. On this episode of An All-American Nightmare, we're going to talk about tests. The stressors they put on you, the pointlessness of the tasks, and hopefully a new style of testing. One that doesn't make your heart pound in your veins. One that doesn't make your blood run to ice. One that doesn't shoot your anxiety through the roof. One that's not about remembering some trivial detail your professor might have lectured about 6 months prior in the middle of his lecture that no one was really paying attention on because you're working full-time and you were half asleep in that class anyways. But a test that tells you who you are, that demonstrates your knowledge, that shows that you not only know your stuff, but you can apply it. Welcome to the All-American Nightmare. Episode 2, Testing the Tests. So let's begin with why we test in academia specifically. It should come as no shock right now that American testing and greater part of American education was originally built off of factory lines. We essentially had to train workers how to work on assembly lines, building components, and the best way to do that was to sit them in a room, explain to them how the job works, and at the very end test them to make sure they were competent and understood what we did with them. Because this is how a lot of people received education to begin with, the fact that factory jobs actually existed before public education ever did, this is pretty much how we structured our education system. And it mostly stood that way up until about the 1920s when we had officially made all schooling public and therefore all children had to go to public school to receive education. This, however, wouldn't really last as it was really only for white students. There was still a sizable amount of minorities who weren't even allowed to go to public school. But in that regard, we essentially use testing in America the same way we use it in a manufacturing or a factory setting. That is, a testing exists for one of three different things. Number one, the test exists to see if a product is good or high quality. You would test the steel you just got in on a shipment to make sure it's of the proper stock to create train tracks, or to create lock components, or to manufacture a rifle. We would also test products in the middle of production to make sure that we're not having any gaps in the assemblage, that the steel going through one end is still proper by the time it gets to the final end. Quality control testing, for lack of a better word. And then, of course, there's the sample testing. This is where we take the completed product and put it through its paces to make sure it's of good quality when we send it off to whoever's going to buy it or whoever requires it. In this regard, they're all the same kind of concept. We are checking to make sure something is up to standard. And for the most part, if something passes its standard, it's moved on to the next step or moved on somewhere else. If it fails, we either render it down and put it back into circulation, or we put it back into production lines to bring it up to those standards. That is to say, in manufacturing, if something fails a test, we either put it into a position where it can better serve its components, i.e. render it down, or we put it back through its trials and get it up to snuff. That is to say, we restructure or re-educate it. But using these all as different concepts of testing, and then throwing under the lockjaw term of testing in general, I feel is kind of a problem. So, real quick, I'm going to give some definitions for us going forward as to how we're to describe each of these methods. Number 1, testing. We will define this as an exam given at the end of an education to give the student a practical application of their obtained knowledge. Basically, a test is kind of like a final exam. Then we have a quiz. A quiz is an exam taken during the education to see if the knowledge in lessons is being kept and understood. This is the sampling. This is the taking the car part out of the production line, checking it out and making sure it's still working before putting it back in and sending it off its way. Then there's an assessment. This is an exam given before an education to see where the student's capabilities are and how the education should be shaped and adapted. This is the quality control sampling of the stock product. This is, before we get you to go to college, we're going to give you an assessment to see what your skills are. And then we'll use that information to figure out what classes you'll be good for, what roles you might best fit, etc., etc., etc. Now, in these 3 examples, I want to be very specific, because each of these is kind of considered as a testing facet that really gets mixed up in academia, because it's the same verbiage we use in the manufacturing. A test should be not only for the students to demonstrate their knowledge, it should also be to rate the teacher. I don't know if any college students are listening, but how many of you have gotten a teacher who on the very first day of class tells all the students to stand up and then asks half the class to sit down and says, that's the amount of people who will be dropping out of my class because they can't make the grade. And then he might take the remaining 50% and have 1/3 of them stand up and the rest sit down and say, this is the amount of you who will have a passing grade that stuck through to the end. Well, if that teacher's tests are that strict that it cuts out all but 1/3 of 50% or 1/15 of the students, that's not a good test. That's a teacher who isn't looking at his testing to see how he can improve it to get the most students to pass. Just like in manufacturing, we want the most amount of product to be possessed out. We don't want to only have 1/15 of our product be suitable for selling to customers. We want to make sure as much of that as possible is going out to the product. That's how we make money. A quiz, however, a quiz is really just for students. A quiz is just for the teacher, well, in a sense it's for the teacher as well, but a quiz is to let teachers know where the students are progressing. Is there a subject that those students are doing bad on? Okay, let's go back and test that out and bring the education up to snuff. Are these students blazing through this part? Yeah, we could probably afford to skip some definitions. If the students are grasping concept in a week, there's no reason to take a month to teach it. And then there's an assessment. An assessment is solely for teachers. There should never be a grade attached to an assessment. Students should come in and take an assessment with no pre-requirements or no expectations for what they grade on it. The assessment is there for the teacher to say, okay, all my students understand the history of Westward Bound Manifest Destiny to the point I'm going to teach it. I don't have to put that into my lessons. We can spend more time on other things. Oh, virtually none of my students understand the capacity of civil rights in America. We have to double down on that. We got to make sure they're all up to snuff. That's what an assessment is for. The idea that all tests need to be passed by students is a fallacious and horrible paradox. It is to say that the student should have a full grasp of the concept before they come into the lessons. Which, if a student grasps all the concept of the lesson, why would they take the lesson in the first place? Just in the same way, if our entire education is built on your grade on a final exam, why would we need the educator? Why not just give the student the final exam study guide, give them the course materials, and then say, hey, I'll see you in 2 months. Lots of places do that. The driving test, for example, says, hey, you have a car? Hey, here's what we're going to be testing you on. Here's the handbook. See you in 6 months. But yet, academia doesn't do this. So why is that? Why do we test in academia? Well, it's a really difficult answer, because to ask why we test in academia is to ask the fundamental and philosophical question, why test at all? I personally don't think that every lesson needs a test, and I personally don't think that every education should require testing. There are just some things you can't test on, and there's just some things you don't need to test on. Just in the same regard, there are things that I would say demand a test. It all comes down to context. But in general, I will say this as a definition. Why do we test? Well, We test to see if the student or the knowledge is properly being administered and replicated and understood by the students, and to be certain that the education being taught by the teachers is proper, up to par, and what we expect of educators. So in other words, the reason why we test in academia is pretty much the same reason why we test in manufacturing. I guess even though the two concepts are far apart, they do kind of have some similarities. Okay, so we admit that testing has a place in academia and that it's really not going anywhere anytime soon, and that some things have to be tested on. But how do we decide whether something's a good test or a bad test? I'm sure we've all been down that road of getting really upset over how a test is done. Well, I put together 7 premises that I think outline how to judge whether something is a good or bad test, and that can be applied towards all testing. Obviously, analytical math is a lot different than speculative history. So let me start with my first premise. The knowledge of the test should be practical and not trivial. That is to say, in a history test, we shouldn't just be memorizing names and dates. We should be learning how to apply the knowledge. The basis of history is we learn from the past to help make predictive models for the future. Just as in math, we don't want to take a homework problem that the students have had on every homework assignment ever and they just can copy down the answers. We want to give them a new set of variables and see if they can figure themselves out through that. That's the whole point of learning math. Premise number 2. The test is designed to be an equal expression of multiple styles of thought, not merely the preferred methods of the educator. This is to say that just because the educator has a preferred method of learning history, it doesn't mean that his test should be requiring you to match that preferred form of history teaching. Every student learns and recites information differently. Some students learn best through names and dates. People like me learn best when we have cultural ramifications to attach to. We sing songs. The reason I remembered how to spell most of the words in my English class for vocabulary and spelling bees is because I would put fancy songs to them and basically make a little jig when I sang, and that was how I spelled the word. Just in the same way, some students are kinesthetic learners. They only understand history if they can physically touch the objects or look at models or look at pictures and art from that time frame. Now, with math, it's a little more complicated, as most of math is reciting algebra and formulae, but different styles of method do work. I understand in math there is kind of set formulas we tend to prefer for students to use, but as long as the student is showing their work and getting the right answer from their work and that they have checked their work and it works back through and everything is kosher, no one really cares about their specific functions and reasoning for how they got the right answer. If they do their work, or if they show their work, and they get the right answer out of it, who really cares? And it's consistent. Obviously, if you know the right answer, you can make anything work backwards. Premise number 3. The test must be devised by the educator themselves. There may be some overarching doctrine to account for, or a vote by committee of similar like-minded educators, but the educator has tendered the test, therefore they watch the test, and it is of their own making. This is going to go over more in our next episode about prepackaged curriculums, but I highly believe that educators who are teaching history in their specific style should be allowed to teach on the education they brought up. That is to say that if a teacher has taught it in their lectures and lessons and work, it should be reflected in their test. We have no idea what someone else has been teaching children, so taking their test, it's not functional. We wouldn't use a mathematician to teach history, just in the same way that we shouldn't have a corporate classification that has its own preferences and biases and whatnot, educating a small town group of students that might not have any idea what the concepts were. In this way also, we're seeing how the educator is functioning their curriculum. If an educator gives a bunch of students a test on stuff they went over and all the students fail the same question, that can tell us that the educator might not have taught that subject very well. But if the educator gets the test from some other group and they fail that lesson, we don't know if the teacher didn't teach that, we don't know if the corporation or the prepackaged curriculum worded the question incorrectly, or we don't know if what they were testing on specifically to alter their curriculum. It just gets a lot of garbled up. So, in reality, if the teacher teaches it, the teacher should make the test. The teacher should not be giving tests that are made by somebody else, even if their curriculum is prepackaged. All tests should be handmade by teachers. Premise number 4. The test must not require strictly linear thinking or perfect recall of phrases to achieve a passing grade. This goes back to trivial knowledge, but in the same regard, we shouldn't be looking for very specific words. We should be asking open-ended questions and letting the students provide those words and vocabulary as they see fit. This is kind of in relation to our read technique video from earlier, where you kind of let the students explain them themselves. If a student has perfect recall of a subject and explains it to you in long, drawn-out functions like the lecture teaches, we know that student has been paying attention to lectures and has grasped that knowledge. If we just go for word association, the student could have only listened to a handful of information or taken a handful of notes and happened to remember that mitochondria and powerhouse tend to go well together. There's also the chance for just guessing. I mean, if you look at a cell and can parcel out, endoplasmic reticulum, ER on this picture must be the same thing. You can do that as well. So requiring point A to point B to point C type thinking and very specific recall doesn't always work for some students, especially now that we're finding out in studies that stress and a lot of mental health issues actually impair people's ability for recall. So testing people on whether or not they have perfect recall is more of a test on who has an easier life and who has basically just been partial listening to the bits and pieces and skimming and scanning the lectures, and less on proving that they understand the concepts. Premise number 5. The test must not be built for the ease of grading. Tests built for easy grading is a paradox of working a solution into a problem. This is more about scantrons, but I feel it should be addressed. Teachers who say, well, I'm only putting 5 questions on the test because it's faster for me to grade, it saves less paper, stop. It's a test. It's supposed to be a grand culmination of our knowledge. I'm okay with killing a few extra trees and the teacher's taking a little over a week to properly check my work and make sure I'm receiving a proper grade, rather than being able to go home, sit down and watch The Bachelorette and crack out a bunch of tests real fast. Testing quickly is an anathema to proper education, because testing quickly means trivial knowledge, perfect recall, an answer key set. It does not turn out application of knowledge, application of math. It doesn't give you time to get into the student's head and see what they're thinking and do a proper analysis. Also, you'll notice, students, that when a teacher tends to grade faster, they tend to make a lot more mistakes. And obviously, if we're testing on a perfect level to make sure our product can go out into the world, but the person who's testing is constantly making minor errors, it kind of sends mixed messages, doesn't it? However, before I move forward, I do want to talk about scantrons. Scantrons actually are not the biggest issue people make them out to be. I personally have been teaching and using scantrons for a long time. I don't prefer doing it because if you miss one spot, you can mess them all up. There's a weird optical illusion, and if you're like me and you're colorblind, you have to put A and B on top of your tests, because some teachers will tell you, well, make your answers on the pink sheet, and you'll go, which pink sheet? I only have a yellow sheet and an orange sheet. And that's how I discovered I was colorblind in 5th grade. Point being, scantrons work for large multiple choice questions, and they have their place in education as a tool. I don't consider scantrons testing, and therefore they didn't make this list. Say what you will about scantrons, they have their place. Premise number 6. The knowledge should be up to date and designed for our modern world. Testing solely on the facets of opinion is not the business of academia, it's the business of indoctrination. This is to say that saying Christopher Columbus discovered America to elementary students is not exactly a good idea, because as the students grow up, they consider to think that, and we now know that Leif Erikson actually discovered the North American continent long before. Christopher Columbus only ever landed in Cuba and the Bahama regions, and also, in fact, we're finding out now through anthropological evidence that people in Native North America actually came from South America through an invasion across the seas from Africa with our greatest ancestors. So this is to say that the First Nation people discovered America. It's a lot more drawn out, and obviously students have a hard time understanding that, but this idea of a very basic cut-down curriculum on history tends to lead to a very basic cut-down understanding when you apply it. Garbage in is garbage out. We don't want to teach opinions in school. We want to teach actual kids who think, because children who think question, and children who question make discoveries. And discoveries is what fuels academia. Having a bunch of drones really doesn't help anybody. And yes, I understand that education for a long time has been more in the business of producing drones than it is for producing critical thinkers. But again, this project is to address that. On a second point, I'd also like to bring up the updated information. There's a common trope in the more southern and rural states of a type of education in biology, my preferred subject, called intelligent design. That's essentially a conservative Christian young earth, I actually think is the proper term. I know it's not all Christians, I think it's just a subset of Christians, who believe that the earth is only 7,000 years old and that evolution doesn't exist. despite the fact that we've proven both micro and macro evolution on a variety of scales in a variety of lab settings. To teach children that the Earth is only 7,000 years old is just demonstrably false. We've proven that far back at the 1800s. That's knowledge that was generally accepted by the scientific community for over 200 years, and on top of that, we also have that knowledge proved by numerous geological studies. We have civilizations that are over 7,000 years old. Predominantly the Mesopotamians and the Aztecs and the Egyptians, but still over 7,000 years old. So that's just demonstrably false. Teaching that to students is just handicapping them for the future. It's just not right. It's not correct. It's not factual. So we shouldn't be teaching it. Just as when we find new information that disproves a lot of psychological studies, we stop listening to that too. There's an old saying I have where I consider all psychology studies before the 1990s to be bunk, since a lot of psychological studies in the 1950s were more involved with proving racist sentiments. In the 1980s, it was more about just proving serial killers were a product of their mothers and the Freudian complex. And really only in the 1990s have we started changing a lot of our psychological thinking to reflect scientific evidence, MRI scans, brain scans, what have you. That's how academia works. We get new information, we build upon it. Academia is constantly changing and improving to have the most up-to-date information. Why should we instill that concept in our children? The final premise is the basis of testing must not eclipse the education, i.e., don't teach to the tests. And we'll go more into this in the next section when we discuss standardized testing and the SATs, but this is incredibly important and something that really defined my education in my younger years. Don't teach to tests. Teaching to a test is only teaching students to pass a test. It's not teaching them education, it's not teaching them critical thinking, it's taking advantage of a naive group of people and telling them, if you do this, it's the only way you can be worth anything. Your grade on a test is what your grade value and your worth is in society. That's not in the business of academia. That's the business of indoctrination. That's like going into archaeology and looking for truth rather than looking for facts. Do not teach to tests. Your life is not determined by tests. Tests do not come in a standard form. When you go to get a job interview, they're not going to give you the WASL. When you go on a date, they're not going to give you the HISPE. Testing to a test is to tell students that passing a grade to make the school look good is more important than learning and being a critical thinker. That's just not what academia is about. Those are my 7-step processes. Obviously, not all tests will pass these. Like I said, some tests you can't test for, and some things you have to test certain ways. But that's the premise by which I'm going to go forward talking about whether tests are good or bad. And I recommend that other students and educators use this as kind of a flow for how they should test. I would now like to talk about 2 really big tests that kind of eclipse all of American education. When you think testing in America, you're going to think of these 2 things. Unfortunately, one of them I had to use my state's standardized testing that is called the WASL, the Washington Assessment of Student Learning, because not only does every single state have its own version of standardized testing, they have multiple versions of standardized testing that has changed over the years, but they all keep to this similar vein. So I'll be going forward using the WASL for my personal anecdotes and example statements, but a lot of what the WASL does can be applied to other states' general education formats, because they're mostly made by the same people. The other test we'll be talking about is the SAT, and that one is a little more of a rabbit hole. I wasn't able to conduct a proper video for the SAT just to itself, and it really does deserve that. To make an SAT-only video, I would probably have enough material for 2 hours of speaking, and this video itself is already getting pretty long. So I'm only going to be doing a tertiary, carnal, surface-level jab at the SATs. For more information, I've linked down below several studies and the Wikipedia article with all of its citations if you want to be interested more in the SATs. But going forward, let's talk about my standardized education test, the WASL, or Washington Assessment of Student Learning. The Washington Assessment of Student Learning is an educational assessment system in Washington State as a measure of student progress. It ran from 1992 to 2009, where after 12 years of operation, it was replaced by the HISPE, where it ran until about 2014. The concept of the HISPE was virtually identical to the WASL, and only after 2014, which is about the same time I stopped being involved in academia, It changed a few times, and I haven't been able to get any updated information on it because the updated information comes out every 5 years, and 2019 didn't exactly get published yet, so I apologize for the information being a bit out of date. Among the issues with the WASL prompt up several, serious concerns. Number one, there was a lot of unreasonable expectations. Unreasonable expectations in consideration of minority groups. This is something you're going to find out as we go on in my research and as we go on this video. A lot of these standardized tests are heavily skewed against people of color and minority groups. That is to say that tests in America are heavily favored towards rich, affluent, white people who have an educational background of some status. Not only did it favor middle-class students and have unreasonable expectations, but in 2006, it was opposed for being a single indicator for success. Much like I said back in my 7th premise, having a standardized test for everything and having a one-size-fits-all metric doesn't work in academia. And having this test be the be-all, end-all of, if you don't pass the WASL, you don't go on to the next grade, kind of was a lot of stress to put on students. The WASL, by the way, was administered to 3rd and 4th and 5th graders at their youngest, all the way up to high schoolers. Telling a 3rd grader about age 8 or 9 that if they don't pass this test, they're not going to be able to go on, and they're going to be held back, and they're not going to get into good college, they're not going to be able to go to high school, and their parents are going to take away all their toys. It's kind of borderline child abuse when you really think about it. Another problem with the WASL was it was based around human scoring with questionable qualifications and info backgrounds. I tried to look into this, and unfortunately I couldn't find a single copy of the WASL that was actually administered. I could find plenty of samples, but I couldn't find an actual scored WASL test that someone put out there to demonstrate the human scoring aspect. It just didn't exist. I even went so far as to call the Washington State Education Department and ask for a copy, and was basically left on hold for the better part of 3 hours. It was really fun. But essentially, how human scoring works is during writing and reading assessments where students have to write out their answers, you can't simply grade that the same way you would like a math problem. So they would collect people. Initially, the plan was to have academics, teachers, people who worked in the educational fields to grade these tests, along with the span of where they'd be working in. Unfortunately, those teachers are usually having jobs and can't take time away to grade hundreds of thousands of tests all over Washington State. So what often happened is they would pull in people from all over via Craigslist or, for lack of a better term, employment agencies who had bachelor's degrees, not necessarily in education, but, I mean, there was one account of someone with a certification in welding that they were passing off as a bachelor's degree in welding who was grading tests. They also have what's called a scoring quota. This is to say that if a lot of students are scoring 5s, the test keeper might come in and say, well, some of you guys are grading pretty liberally. Like, we're doing sampling, and we're finding a lot of these tests that are like 4s and 5s are actually like 2s and 1s. So if you could kind of be a little bit more strict about that rating, which right then and there is just completely ignoring the fact of a test. You don't grade on the numbers you need, you grade on the numbers you actually have. Statistics 101. Another issue was during disagreements of scores, that is to say that someone thought that a paragraph or an essay answer that scored a 5 was actually more like a 3, they would get a collection of 4 other people together, and as long as 55% of the consensus was reached, they would rewrite the grade. That is to say, you only need 3 people to agree that the grade needed to be dropped down, or alternatively, you need 2 people to agree to it, and the final person would be, the tie vote would be the official educator. So in this case, it's 3 out of 5. But voting on a grade doesn't matter, because what the grade was is what the grade was. Unless the person put like one sentence and you're grading that as a 5 when it's an essay question, which is just patently false, you shouldn't be dickering over whether or not the score was a 5 or a 4. Just give them a 5 and move on, benefit of the doubt. The other issue that we run into a lot in cases of the WASL was that by 2006, half of the 10th graders did not pass the math section, among grades being down across the board. Now, a lot of these information I had to double check. A lot of the statements from the actual report were actually doctored themselves, so the people who were reviewing the WASL also had an agenda. So you'll have to forgive me if some of these numbers are a little off and some of the stats have changed since I've done this video. But in 2006, half of the 10th graders couldn't pass the math section. That's across the board. That's white students, that's people of color, that's minority groups, that's impoverished, wealthy, that's everybody. To me, as an educator, that immediately screams that something is wrong with our testing or something is wrong with our education. We have to find out what, but that, just right there, a red flag has gone up. Due to the high failure rates of this test, it was voted on by the Washington Educational Association, the president of that teachers union, to drop it as a graduation requirement. Basically, so many students would have failed that year and not been able to graduate that they just waived them. Which, number one, again, explains to you why it's a bad idea to have this as a single verification test. If this test is the only way you get to graduate and half of you fail, what are we supposed to do? Well, keeping to the single-use system and basically claiming the system works is to fail half of the 10th graders in Washington State. However, that's going to look pretty bad on federal standards and definitely cause some investigations. So what do? You waive it, basically making the entire process pointless. In fact, in 2006, Snohomish County Journal, and yes, for those of you outside of Washington, it is pronounced Snohomish, found that the WASL was based on the work of a superintendent and public instruction, Robert Karhoff, who was paid $1 million to restructure the Washington learning system around his thinking. This is to say the WASL was not originally designed by committee, as it was advertised. I remember growing up and someone telling me constantly that the Washington Assessment of Student Learning was developed by educators, doctorates, people who had been in academia for years, all coming together to compile an assessment of student learning. When in reality, it was a public superintendent who had never really taught in class before, supervisory capacity, obviously, but had never taught students, essentially just making up a test and saying, yeah, that'll do. And then getting paid $1 million each year to do it, on top of his actual learning study and on top of his salary as a superintendent. It's also theorized, although I cannot put this beyond speculation, that Mr. Karhoff was a little bit racist, as a lot of these testings were heavily skewed against minority groups. Now, I'm not going to confirm or deny that, because as we see with a lot of testing, especially when I was growing up, minorities were just not considered in education. In fact, it's only recently that people have really started caring about people of color in academia as far as young students. Even up until the 90s, it was still often joked about people being color being in colleges, and up until about the late 2000s, colleges and academia was still very white. It still is very white. So consider that if you will. If you have your reservations, I understand. If not, I can't speculate on that. But I do have to do a service of putting it out there. In terms of people of color, however, 3/4 of people of color, predominantly African American students and Latinx males, failed at least one of the 10th grade levels beyond math. This is to say that not only did half of the students in Washington fail the math, if you were people of color, there was a good chance that there was going to be another thing you failed. 3/4 of people of color, and in Washington State, that's actually a lot of people. Washington State is a very diverse state, unless you go to Eastern Washington. We won't talk about the dark place. In that grouping, 2/3 of First Nation peoples were not on track for earning a diploma under the WASL standards. Now, in Washington, we have some of the better tribal relations on the reservations with the First Nation peoples. We do try to care about them as much as we can, but the fact that 2/3 of them were considered not on track for this diploma was really disconcerting, especially considering that tribal schools, despite our good relations, don't get nearly enough funding, and on top of that, a lot of tribal schools have extremely high dropout rates. We're talking graduating classes of about a couple 60, 70 students, not the hundreds and 200s that you get anywhere else. So this was really, really devastating to the Native people. On top of that, 70% of students living at or below the poverty line failed one or more of their education requirements. So we're really seeing a structure here. This test is very much proving statistically and demonstrably that it cares more about white, affluent, educated students than it does about people of color, First Nations, or those impoverished or at below the poverty line. That's not what academia is about. Academia isn't about pandering to the upper white class. It's about everybody getting an education. The best escape from poverty and from persecution is education. Education and knowledge is one of the most important things people can seek, because no one can grade you on your education. No one can take from you your knowledge. They can take your clothes, they can take your house, they can take your skin, but they can never take from you the knowledge you have or your applications of that knowledge. First Nation people have a massive history and are quintessential to the state of Washington. People of color are essential to American history. American history is Black history. But to completely ignore them entirely and leave them at essentially a test that's designed to shoot them in the foot is really telling of a racist system, or at least a system that is heavily disenfranchising people of color, minorities, and the impoverished. Now, as far as these groups and these notes go, this gap of students was in line with other parts of academia. That is to say, as much as I've played this up, these are students who are already being affected by academia, and therefore this gap didn't widen on a retrospective look. So we can honestly say that while the test wasn't structured to specifically attack them, it certainly wasn't doing them any favors. That is to say, the Washington Assessment of Student Learning was more in line with attacking people of color, the impoverished, and those of non-wealthy, white, affluent classes just as much as the academia system it's providing for did. This is why I said that I doubt Kharkov was actually racist, rather just a byproduct of a systemically racist system. Just putting in my 2 cents on that. Moving forward, by May of 2007, the math section was delayed by order of our governor, Christine Gregoire at the time, I do believe. The science section was also delayed at implementation because the standards were needed to pass reading and writing for 2008 were almost impossible. This is to say that most students couldn't pass the math and science as it pre-existed, so they had to take the system out and throw it back into research and development to make it better. And they would do the same thing in 2008 for the reading and writing sections, which, when you consider that the class of 2008 was a rather tumultuous time with the subprime mortgage crisis and the rampant infection of, there's a high rise in school shootings and in persecutions of LGBTQ students at that time, really not a good time to be a student in high school in 2008. And I'm speaking from experience. By 2008, that next year, the math section would just be canceled outright. For 2008 until 2011, you could ultimately fail the math portion and still graduate high school. In 2009, they would do the same thing with the science portion, but to be fair, the science portion was always such an issue because on the board of the WASL at that time, intelligent design or intelligent curriculum was being pushed into science classrooms, which outright denied evolution. So, again, just a really tumultuous time. By 2010, the WASL would be completely abandoned, and students would not need to take it for the graduation process, which is good. Unfortunately, it took just shy of 10 years to get to that point. 10 years, and ultimately 2 to 3 generations of students were trained and built on this lesson, on this testing sample, and it virtually did nothing for them. In 2011, though, the Math WASL was reworked and added as a graduation requirement, and it stayed there until 2014 as an unofficial exam before it was replaced by simply end-of-course exams. This is to say that the Washington Assessment of Student Learning was so flawed in how it handled math, so consistently across the board, that most math teachers just said, screw it, we're not going to use this anymore, we'll just use our own end-of-course finals like colleges do, and then call that even. Which is really just that sentiment of, fine, you figure it out. By 2014, the WASL would officially be removed and replaced with the HISPE, although for the 4 years between 2010 and 2014, the HISPE really was just a rework of the WASL. It was the same pile of dog crap, just with a different coat of paint on it. I specifically remember this because my generation, or my graduating class, was the final class to receive the WASL in its official capacity, and then the next year we got the WASL the exact same thing, except instead of being green, it was pink, or in my case, orange, because colorblind, and it said HISPE on it. But in fact, if you look through the original HISPE notebook, I think I have a picture of it somewhere on my old Nokia flip phone, there was a picture where it said, "Welcome to the Washington Assessment of Student Learning" on the opening cover page where they explained to you what it is, but on the front cover of the pamphlet, it says HISPE. Which literally just means they swapped out the covers. It was the funniest thing, and a bunch of us made jokes about it. It was all over the news. Digressing back to point. What would follow after the HISPE would be a standardized testing pattern that would change every year. So, good, Washington, after about 12, 13-ish years, you managed to figure out a testing system that can be constantly adapted for standardizing. To this day, the HISPE still exists in Washington. It's called the High School Proficiency Exam, I do believe it's called, or High Scholastic Proficiency Exam, and it's pretty decent. As far as a standardized test goes, it covers the basics. Washington State has ruled they have to have a standardized test as a graduation requirement, so I'd rather have one that can be changed every year as information changes rather than just the WASL, which was founded by one person and was completely overboard. Also, the HISPE have solved the major problem of the WASL in that it was actually made by a committee. The WASL was made by one man, whereas the HISPE every year is made by academics and committees, and they constantly cycle off. So no two committees will make the same HISPE every year, or if they do, it'll be less than 23% of the remaining group from the year previous, which is good. We should have a constant rotation system in academia. Stagnancy is a quick road into hell. So now let's talk about another test that pretty much eclipses all of American academia. This is more for you high school students going into college or college students who are in their freshman year. I'm sure you've recently heard about the SAT, or Standard Aptitude Test, and the hell upon which it was built. Oh, you haven't? Well, allow me to enlighten you. Also to all my European friends, grab your seats and some popcorn. The SAT was originally designed as a screening for recruits in the U.S. Army during World War I, and was originally called the Army Alpha. It's now called the ASVAB. It was one of the first mass-administered IQ tests, and was developed by Carl Brigham, a Princeton professor and psychologist. Because it's always a psychologist. Pretty much most of academia's failings can be tied back to psychologists in some way. Small bias. I don't trust any psychologists after or before 1990. That's about the cutoff for which I trust psychologists. As I said, in the 1950s it was mostly about inhuman experiments, and by the 1980s it was mostly about explaining racism and serial killers to white people. It was originally supposed to last 90 minutes and was 315 questions designed to court basic math skills and vocab. Ostensibly, it was supposed to show that can you work a rifle, can you follow instructions, can you dial in artillery coordinates. Interesting thing about the Army Alpha is that it was not administered to people of color or African Americans. The actual terminology will remain unspoken because it's a racial slur, or women. Apparently you couldn't give this test to women because it would cause hysteria, aka being a woman disease. And you couldn't give it to people of color because they just lacked the superior brain systems of white people. Yeah, that was a common notion back then, that people of color didn't have the same capacity for warfare, and that was a racist sentiment that would experience all the way up until the 1970s in the Vietnam War. I would just like it noted that in World War I, the common sentiment was the British tactic of marching across open ground to machine gun lines, while the artillery fired about 2 feet above your position. Brilliance, I know. By 1926, the College Board had been developed to officially designate the SATs. And let me just be very clear here, the SATs has an incredibly racist beginning, and it doesn't get any better as time goes on. But the SAT, or Standard Aptitude Test, is a standardized test widely used by college admissions in the United States since its debut in 1926. Its official debut in 1926. All colleges had entrance exams before this point in time. However, this was the first time that a truly generalized system was employed. Now, the College Board, the company that owns the SATs and functions the SATs, is wholly owned and developed and publishes the content. It's a private, non-profit organization, and I say non-profit with heavy quotations because, yeah, College Board is not a non-profit organization. It just is not. That's just a complete fallacy. Anybody who says otherwise is either trying to sell you something or hasn't looked up College Board. As of right now, many of you younger students will have to take the SATs in many of your states. Now, in Washington, a lot of colleges are completely doing away with the SAT. You don't have to take the SAT to get into college. And that's great. That's amazing. That's wonderful. We should all be happy. And for one very big reason. Education is what raises people out of poverty and what helps our culture grow. Education is incredibly important and should be the cornerstone of any civilized society. Actually, not even a civilized society. Any society whatsoever has an education system, regardless of how it functions, civilized or otherwise, even though civilized is a heavily racial term. Education is a cornerstone of society. And to have a test that keeps people from being educated is nothing more than handicapping yourself. It's gatekeeping, it's making a boys' club or a girls' club or a whites' club, and really it serves no purpose in this current modern day. We don't need to keep people out of college. There is a higher demand for specialized and skilled and educated labor now than there ever has been before. So why are we kneecapping our foot? How many engineers, doctors, scientists are right now folding clothes or flipping burgers or shuffling through the hallways with a mop and bucket because they just couldn't afford the SAT and were completely held out of college? There's a common saying by abortion advocates, well, anti-abortion advocates, excuse me, that, oh, if you kill that fetus, you could be killing the person who cures cancer. What happens if the person who knows the cure for cancer or is destined to discover it is currently working at Wendy's part-time because they couldn't afford the fee to get to take the SATs and they couldn't go to college and become educated? I mean, it's a complete whataboutism, but I think it's an important whataboutism. So let's talk more about the SAT. Let's digress back. I apologize. The SAT is a combination of tests that takes about 3 hours, ranging across several subjects. It costs about $50 now, $50 to $60 to take, depending if you count for tax. When I took the test, it was about $180 to take. And it's basically, you pay that same amount if you miss the appointment. I recall in New York City that there was a old staying of a man, I do believe his name was Jamarcus Brown, who was on his way to take the SATs to apply for one of the art schools in New York proper. He had to travel from the Bronx all the way up to Manhattan Island to take his test, which is quite a hike, several kilometers, whereupon, with all of his information, his test scores, his appointment, his docket, his identification, all in hand, he was stopped by police officers and detained for 3 days because they didn't believe that an African-American man would be taking the SATs. Granted, he was also charged for having the late fee, but instead of having to pay the late fee after his court hearing, they essentially just said, okay, we'll use the money you paid for the SAT to pay for your late fee. He wasn't refunded his money, and the next year when he did apply for the SAT, he had to pay the additional price. Remember that racist sentiment I outlined earlier on. Now, my personal anecdote about the SAT. I took the SAT in Washington State. I was in what was known as the Central Valley School District, or the CVD. It's somewhere in and around Seattle. I won't give some specifics because I don't want to get doxxed. But here in Seattle, the actual test that I was supposed to take at was all the way up in Everett, which isn't even in the same city as Seattle. I had to take a bus on a weekday in the middle of the summer because both my parents worked, all the way up to Everett, which isn't exactly the best part of town because we had to go through South Park, and that's pretty sketch. And when we got to Everett, it was in a random high school where pretty much you weren't allowed to talk to anybody. You came in, you sat down, you were given your test booklet, they searched me, like, they had a police officer pat me down, make me empty out my pockets. All of my pencils were taken apart to make sure that they were, like actual pencils. To which I was then reminded that I can't have mechanical pencils, I had to have a number 2 pencil, which was not provided for me. So I had to go across the street to the Staples and buy one. And then on top of all of this, during my SAT, in just my classroom alone, there was 3 people who were kicked out. One person had actually built a calculator into their shoe in the sole. They would slide back the cover latch on an Oxford, and they would have a small calculator in there. One girl had written a bunch of formulas and different theories for figuring out geometry onto her thigh and disguised it as part of her thigh tattoo, and then she wore a short dress. And one student, I kid you not, actually had a friend who sat by the window and would actually Google the answers and give them to him. He was found out pretty quickly. That's how serious this test is for a lot of people. They were so desperate to get into the SATs that they were willing to cheat. And by the way, once you cheat, not only do you have to pay the fee to get into the test, which is $180, you then get to pay another fee for cheating. Like, they kick you out, they take your book, they scrap it all down, you don't get a score, it just zeroes out, and you have to try again next year, and you get to pay for cheating. But remember, College Board is a non-profit organization. Yeah. So all this together, the SATs was just hell. When we went to the bathroom to take a break, which our bathroom times were assigned, you could not leave before you had to take the bathroom, which actually led a couple of students that I heard about to install catheters. I'll let that information sit for a second. But when we were in the bathrooms, there was actually a security guard in the men's bathroom who was only letting us in one at a time, and basically you couldn't talk to each other in the bathroom. God forbid you share answers. If you do any such sharing of answers and the security guard heard you, he would catch you both and he would take you and kick your tests out. This is not how we do testing in academia. This is something on par with a North Korean internment camp with the level of security they had for this thing. Oh, and by the way, on the SATs, I scored about average on the SATs. I, however, did pretty poorly on the writing portion, and that's really funny because the writing is built for MLA format. Even though if you ask my friends, I do a ton of creative writing. Like, I've written several short stories, I've written several scientific academic papers, and in my spare time, one of the things I like to do is, write. It's a pastime of mine. But according to the SAT, I'm a very poor and weak writer. So it doesn't have the greatest of predictive capabilities, let's just say that. Again, anecdotal, but what have you. As far as predictive capabilities, there's been a ton of studies around the SATs, and there was so much, in fact, that I just can't even get into the depths of them, as I said before. But here's a fun one for you. Over multiple investigations of the SATs for predictive capabilities, they found out that just because you take the SAT doesn't mean you're going to be a good student. In fact, the SAT has almost zero predictive capabilities after freshman year. Which makes sense, because coming out of high school, you're freshly trained up. Most students immediately transfer into college freshman year, so the old standards and tactics of college or of academia transfer into college. Obviously, you're going to be good at it. By the time you get to senior year, you are so tired and completely numb to the voices of academia, you just don't care. College is just a gauntlet of hell that's designed to more akin the Hanoi Hilton and Vietnam era PTSD survivors than it is to actually educate children. But enough of that. Let's talk about some actual problems with the SATs. Let's talk about some real fundamental stuff, not just Mr. Song whining about his life. So over multiple investigations have turned up that affluent and wealthy students having their SATs either ignored or bought off. This was most recent in the 2019 SAT scandal, which is pretty much, it's what it says on the tin. There was a number of wealthy athletes, of celebrity starlets, or those high-ranking people who just straight up bought off their SAT scores, or could just ignore them entirely and were accepted into colleges regardless. Now, this is a more common, well, it's more an unknown thing, but it was more common for that caste of society in America. During the initial stages of the SATs, up until about the 1950s, rich people were just not expected to take the SATs. If you were going to Juilliard or Harvard or Yale, you didn't have to pay for that. If your parents were an alumni and they were spending money on the college, buying wings or donors or what have you, you just got in for free. You didn't have to take the SAT. It could just be waived. And if you did have to take the SAT or you didn't fit in that grouping, you could actually just go up and pay a fee and they would just give you an average score in your SATs and get in. Of course, the payment was never offered to poor people. It was never even specified to poor people. And about the 1990s, they had to officially stop the practice because there was a scandal then too, about 1993, 1994. Citations below. On top of this, the SAT's 2019 scandal has been heavily covered up by, ironically, the College Board. But one notable accept was an actress's daughter, a pair of twins, who got rowing scholarships to Harvard, despite the fact that the girls didn't even know what the prow was. Now, let me tell you something. My girlfriend, who probably has never set foot on a boat in her life, knew what a prow was. And this woman is supposed to be a rowing instructor. So she wasn't even good at lying about it. She was just, oh yeah, I'm a rower. Oh, you're on a scholarship? Here you go. Welcome to the SATs. Done. You're good. There was a bunch of hedge fund managers. There's been people who have run entire scams on Craigslist trying to get out of the SATs. A lot of the SAT has simply been, if you have the money, you don't have to take it. That's just how it is. It's a standard that it applies to poor people, even though most poor people have to rough through and buy the study materials and pay for all themselves. So, yeah, once again, a different standard for thee and a different standard for me. On top of it being initially designed to be racist and, everything else you've heard so far, it was initially designed to combat poor and impoverished students attending high school or college. So we remember that this test really went into practice in 1926, during the Roaring Twenties, when a large amount of typically impoverished people were moving into colleges. Think about what was going on in America in the 1920s, the Prohibition era. Well, let's think about where a lot of the money was being made, the mob. And so, what did the mob need? A lot of poor people were attracted to the idea of joining the mob to either run or smuggle booze or what have you, or to produce it. And then by making money through the mob, they could afford to send their kids to college. Back then, it was a very common thing that men who had gone and fought in World War I came home, if they could come home. They were too banged up or beat up to work properly because they just suffered through mustard gas and artillery strikes, but they could manufacture booze. They'd manufacture booze, they send their kids off to college so they could be a, educated person, and in case a war ever came back, or if their children needed to go fight in a conflict, they would be educated enough to leave the slums and squalor that the people had lived in. This is what's known as the Great Enlightenment in America, that a lot of people were able to get education for the first time through GI Bills and through spending. So this pest showing up in about the late 1920s, about the same time there was a huge influx of typically impoverished and poor moving into college academia, really kind of says a lot of rich people didn't want to be associating with the poor, so they just slammed a little test down on there that the poor people couldn't pass, because most poor kids dropped out of high school or whatever education they had at about age 14, 16 to help out their parents to pay for rent and what have you. Now let's talk about the College Board specifically and its non-profit roots, despite the fact it looks almost exclusively designed to extract money from poor people. Multiple companies work alongside the College Board to make the SAT prep materials. That's how it's been for a very long time. My mother, in fact, informed me that when she was trying to get into college, when she was young, that in order to get an SAT practice book, you either had to purchase one through a direct catalog, which, adjusting for inflation, was about $100 for this book, money that most people just didn't have, or you could go to the library. A library that was a good solid 5 miles from where she lived, to have the one test book in the entire county. On top of that, that test book was almost always checked out by other students. There were entire groups dedicated to studying it. At one point in time, it wasn't allowed to leave the library, and you couldn't photocopy it, because when you look on a lot of College Board books, photocopying and processing of the materials is strictly prohibited, and you can be sued for it, because you know that they want their money. Now, this has been pretty much the standard policy for a long time. College Board has had very exclusive and lucrative contracts with a lot of different educational groups to manufacture their study materials. Everything from test booklets, to test guides, to online doctrine, everything. Until about 2015, 2016, when Khan Academy was allowed to purchase the rights and provide free test materials. Go Khan Academy. If it's a doctrine that everybody has to take to get into college, the education and practice materials should be free as a default. If everybody's supposed to go to college, all the testing materials that get you in should be free. That just makes sense. That being said, Khan Academy, they put some of their materials on their free site, but if you want to get the really good tutoring things, obviously there's packages you can buy through Khan Academy for the really up there premium stuff. So yeah, I mean, someone has to stir the gravy, I guess. We've already talked about the predictive capabilities, but let's also note where the predictive capabilities had a very big shortcoming. You see, the SAT, which heavily censors itself, because if you go and look up SAT controversies online, you're going to have to sift through the first 10 searches being about controversies for other things, that just Google search the word controversy, or a bunch of SAT purchasing and prep books. That is to say that the College Board is doing a lot to make sure that Google and search engines do not allow their more dark history to shine through. One of the reasons why my research was so hard to find. But the predictive capabilities of the SATs, the thing that they basically pride themselves on, if you take the SAT, that's how colleges know you're going to be a good student later on, as I said, only work for freshmen. But that's only when you control for socioeconomic policies. As it turns out, there is actually no better improvement or no statistical change to prove that the SAT is a good predictor for who's going to be a good student. It has the same predictive capabilities as high school GEDs or diplomas do. The exact same. And it's only good for the freshman year. The reason why they go outside of that on the SAT website is because they control for socioeconomic factors. That is to say, poor people don't take the SATs because they can't afford it. Therefore, we don't count them. As the old saying goes, there are little white lies, big black stodgy lies, and then there's statistics. And numbers don't lie, but you can make them say whatever you want. I can't stress enough how finding this information was just a pain. I had to sift through a lot of information, a lot of videos to find this, and most of the information I found I later had to get rid of because the data was just structured against me. College Board has a lot of money behind them, and they do a lot of jobs censoring what does and does not get through. They have a ton of companies that work with them. They're just simply not a non-profit as they like to pretend to be. In fact, one of the members of the non-profit organizations, one of the facets of that is that people publish their tax returns and earnings every year. This is how we do non-profits in America. If someone gives you a donation, you have to note that down. How much the donation was and for what specifics. And the people individually cannot take the donation. It has to go to the non-profit. However, with College Board, not so much. Not only do we not know who's a part of the College Board that's making the SATs, unless you Google them individually and they happen to note that in their LinkedIn profiles, we don't know how much they're making. And if you have nothing to hide, you should be able to see that. Everybody else does it. Same thing with Goodwill. Goodwill CEO publishes his taxes every year. College Board, not so much. Which is why I say outright that College Board just isn't a non-profit, because they don't have the evidence to back that up. There's just too much that they can do with too little money to not be non-profit. So let me go back into my opinion on this. In conclusion, the SATs are really just a bunch of old, rich academics who like the system the way it is, who are individually designing tests to keep the poor and impoverished out of academia, as they always have. But is this an actual instigative event, isolated to itself, or is this more a problem of academia at large? I'm sorry to say this, but I think it's more a problem of academia at large. Academia has always been a cultural elitist system. It's always favored rich, white, affluent people. It has always statistically given not more than a tinker's damn, pardon my French, about people of color, minorities, First Nation people, or the impoverished. The SAT is a symptom of a greater illness. It's not just the testing that's a problem, it's the racism that's a problem. And while we haven't gone a long way to calling out this systemic injustice, I'm sorry to say, but we got a long way to go. Washington took a good first step, just saying the SATs aren't necessary, mostly because of COVID, but we have no idea if that's going to hold after the COVID epidemic is gone. If we just get rid of it for a few months and we see that more students apply for college, that's a good thing. We want more people in academia, especially people of color. But if we're just going to put the SAT back into practice once the pandemic dies down, we're going to be right back to step one. So now for the call to action. Students, educators, parents, people who care. Fight as hard as you can to get the SAT removed. It's your best chance for children to get into academia. Fight for standardized testing, if it has to exist, to only exist in the capacities I've outlined with my 7 steps, and also to fight for testing that changes every year and is more generally designed as a set standard that can alter and adapt and change. Don't just do strict linear thinking. Your students, your children, your educators, they're all bright, amazing people. They don't need to be held back or kept in this rigid box by testing just because someone somewhere wants to make $1 or someone somewhere has a vested interest. Education is supposed to set you free, not put a new pair of shackles on you. For the final part of this video, and I would like to thank you all for staying with me for this one being almost over an hour long, I would like to introduce a new method of teaching that I did when I was doing my student teaching that I've now found out in one of my community colleges I attended is now a standard application for history. Below in the description of this video is going to be a PDF for what's known as the tri-tier testing method, or I like to call it the song testing method, taking after my last name. The song testing method is a test designed to keep students from being stressed out and to more apply their knowledge. There's very little memorization required, and I would like students to try and take it and just see how they score on it. Don't look up any of the answers initially, just take the test as it is. I've cramped everything together to make it more smaller and more compact, but expand as you need the information or do it on a separate sheet of paper. But my test stands out in one specific regard. My test, number 1, does not require 100% to pass. There are 200 points of questions written on my test, but you only have to take 100 to pass. That's your score. I specifically have a history version down below, but there's a reason for this. Making kids a catch-all, jack-of-trades, master of none in history has just clearly not worked. Look at the 2016 and 2020 elections. People don't care about history. History is oh so much people using what they need to prove a point. But the application of history therein is what's gradually becoming more and more sapient. We see more people being concerned about people of color who have been statistically ignored in history. We see more and more people demanding that African American history be taught as a standard part of the curriculum, not as a simple expectation or as an exploratory class. The song testing method asks that you get 100 points on a test out of 200, and that's your score out of 100. Prove to me and demonstrate to me you have the knowledge. Anything above that I would use as extra credit for other problems. If you got a question wrong but you had extra points, you could cover it over. So there's an incentive to go higher than 100%. And it also does a very important thing in academia. It shows me the 3 different types of students I would have in history class. If I have students that got closer to 200% of the points, that's a student that really cares about history. And if I had to advise them in college, I would say, hey, you have a knack for history. Go into a history degree, histrionics, English, literature, what have you. If I got students that got in and around 100% consistently across the board, I'd say, okay, these are kids who are just here for a grade. And that's fine. A lot of education teaches you to just get the grade and go. And if I got kids below 100%, with as basic as my test was, it's very simple, but it is complex, I knew for a fact that student just didn't care. As opposed to modern systems where you have a student who misses 3 problems and the problems are 5 points apiece, that's 85%. How do you know that student just didn't care versus that student actually just made some mistakes? But on my model, where there's 200 points possible and a student only gets 34%, I know for a fact that student really is struggling or just really doesn't care. And if a student doesn't care, they need to find a way to make them care. Try the test out, see what you like about it. If not, I appreciate you listening in. On our next episode of the All-American Nightmare, we'll be covering a prepackaged curriculum, but I have to warn you in advance that I've been having some trouble getting the information and a lot of legalese has popped up. So stay tuned in case I have to make changes or skip that episode. Sorry for the inconvenience. I'd like to thank you all once again for sticking with me for this hour and learning about the American education system, and I encourage you to write in on some of your issues and your stories about testing in America and what you think of it. I'd also ask you to expand this around the globe and around your friends group to see if anybody else agrees. Citations will be down in the description for all my knowledge. I'm trying out a different format this time around since I got a lot of concerns about my last video, so hope this is more in the right direction. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next episode.